Hello, everybody. Good afternoon and welcome to this event. And let me first of all say something about the organizers. So my name is Thomas Wetzer. I'm the head of department of the International Relations Department here at CU. And we have just finished a two-day conference entitled Politics of Knowledge Production and the Russo-Ukrainian War in cooperation with CU's Invisible University for Ukraine. So we are one of the co-organizers of this event. And the other co-organizer is the CIVICA Alliance. The CIVICA Alliance is an alliance of 10 leading European universities. You can see the names of all the universities listed over there. CIVICA is a network that is actively sort of encouraging cooperation among these universities in the fields of research, so, sort of funding research. It's also promoting student and faculty mobility across the network. And it's also active in civic and outreach activities, and this is kind of what we are engaged in today, and that is kind of part of CIVICA's Tour d'Europe public lecture series. And this public lecture series is actually funded by NAWA, the Polish National Agency for Academic Exchange, and is part of the NAWA, more specifically part of the NAWA Initiative for Solidarity with Ukraine. So thank you for this support. And so let me now introduce our three panelist speakers today. On the left is Viktoria Sereda, who is a sociologist, currently the head coordinator of the Virtual Ukraine Institute for Advanced Studies at the Wissenschaftskolleg to Berlin. She is also senior advisor of the research group Prisma Ukraine War, Migration and Memory at the Forum of Transregional Studies. In the middle of our round is Mary Kaldor, who is a professor at the London School of Economics, also directing a Foreign Office funded project on the Russo-Ukrainian War. And she's currently a distinguished visiting professor at the CEU's International Relations Department. And to my left is Anton Shekhovtsov, who is currently also in our department as a visiting researcher and lecturer. And at the same time, Anton is the head of the NGO Center for Democratic Integrity, which is based here in Vienna. He's also an associated researcher at the Research Center for the History of Transformations at the University of Vienna as well. So welcome to all our guests. And the procedure is, I suppose, for those of you who came for a CIVICA event already, the same as normal. So we will invite our three panelists to give introductory presentations, each 10 minutes. And after that, we will have an initial set of questions here among ourselves. And then after that, we have the last part of the event for open public questions and answers. And just as a technical point for those who follow the event online, if you have your questions, if you could please write these questions into the chat rather than speaking directly. So please just write into the chat. Okay, I hope I didn't forget anything. Don't see disagreement. So with that, without further ado, then I would like to suggest whoever wants to start. We didn't actually agree on the order yet, but perhaps Mary would want to.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm really pleased to be at a CIVICA event. I've had a CIVICA research project, which was really enjoyable and interesting, so I'm very grateful to CIVICA. Some of you may have read or reports, you may not have read the original essay that's just been published by the Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. He wrote a really interesting essay about how the war has reached a stalemate position, very similar to the First World War, because of the equalization of military technology. And I think what the Ukraine war shows us is actually something we should have learned from Korea, we should have learned it from Vietnam, we should have learned it from Iraq, from Afghanistan, that it's really difficult to win wars nowadays in the classic way of controlling territory militarily, what Thomas Schelling, the famous American strategist, called compellence. It's really difficult to use military force to make somebody do what you want them to do. And it doesn't mean that military force can't be incredibly destructive, and nor does it mean that military force doesn't have other utilities. It just means the kind of classic war that we think of as in the past is really impossible nowadays, not just because it might lead to nuclear war, but because it's really, really difficult to win. So, as I said, it doesn't mean that war doesn't have utility. And what I call new wars are very similar to what the Russian, I think he's the chief of the he's the chief of staff, Gerasimov. He wrote an article just a year before the Ukraine war began called Non-Linear War. And in that article, he said it's really easy to reduce a country to chaos through a combination of local dissidents, special forces, and what he called political technology, notably influencing social media. And actually, when you look at what Russia did in Ukraine in 2014, it really followed the Gerasimov template. And actually, what Russia's done in Chechnya and Syria is extremely similar, if we'd been following what Russia has done. It hasn't actually succeeded in controlling territory. Chechnya's bandit country hasn't succeeded in Syria, but it has succeeded very effectively in creating chaos, which makes the development of a normal democracy very, very difficult. And so I think what I'm really worried about, and this is my big concern, is if the war lasts for a really long time, will it turn into a similar type of new wars in which the point is really to reproduce the situation of disorder? Can, on the Ukrainian side, this current wonderful civic spirit be maintained over a long period? Will there be the kind of use of violence for economic purposes, for mobilizing ethnic hatred? Is that sort of thing a possibility in the future? And isn't that very alarming if that's on Europe's border? So I'll come back to that in a minute, but I just want to say a few words about the implications for the European order, because that's what we were asked to talk about. And I think actually the war has already had considerable implications for the European order. And I don't just mean in the sense that it's produced a cohesion in support of Ukraine, which it has, and it's speeded up the shift to renewable forms of energy, which it also has. But I think particularly significant has been the new debate within NATO. I was rather surprised to be invited to a seminar to discuss the new strategic concept, which was passed last year, where they wanted to talk about human security. And I thought, well, this is astonishing. Why do we want to talk about human security, particularly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine? And a senior person in NATO said to me, well, the Ukraine war has been a wake-up call. We realized that we've been planning for a war involving millions of civilian casualties. That's the way we imagined it. And if it was real, it would be completely unacceptable. So there's a really fundamental rethink, I think, going on in NATO. You can ask, I won't say a lot about it, which involves this shift in the nature of deterrence, a shift towards a much more conventional defensive strategy and towards more emphasis on resilience, with the idea of deterring any invasion through the knowledge that it can't succeed, rather than the way NATO's always planned it, that NATO will use nuclear weapons the minute Russia invades. And then there's also an emphasis on human security, on women, peace and security, on climate change, all of which is very new. So I would say two things. I think we all thought that the European Union's external security policy would be very influenced by the NATO and become more warfighting over time. I think the opposite is the case, that NATO security culture is becoming more like the European Union's. And I think it's actually becoming more European, partly because of the experience we tried, and partly because of the membership of additional membership of Sweden and Finland. So what we're seeing, which I think is a constructive shift, is a shift away from classic warfighting towards something that is more defensive and more about defending human beings. And of course, just one other point before I finish. I think the security context can't be delinked from the economic and environmental context. The EU has provided something of the order of 67 billion euros in assistance, even though it's been very slow to arrive. And it's also, as I mentioned, speeded up in order to speeded up the shift to renewables in order to reduce dependence on Russian gas. Having said that, the EU is still very dependent on Russian oil. And actually what it spends on Russian oil is about as much as what it provides to Ukraine. And so again, one of the big lessons of the Ukrainian war has to be that there's a real link between climate change and war, and climate change and dictatorship. If you look around the world at most of the new wars, they are carried on by autocratic, authoritarian leaders who are dependent on minimal revenues. So moving out of oil and gas is not just about the planet, but that's hugely important. It's also about moving away from rich dictators. So a final point, going back to my depressing scenario, can I think of a more positive scenario? And, you know, one of the remarks that was made in our conference was the Ukrainian war is all like no other. And I think that's really true, that whereas Russia is very typical of the new wars, using all of the tactics, bombing of civilians, bombing of hospitals, sexual violence, looting, these are all typical characteristics of new wars. Ukraine has really been, and oddly enough, I think what somebody earlier today said much of Olex said many of similar things. I think that Ukraine is doing things in a very different way. Ukraine is, in a way, pioneering a civic state. And by that, I mean the idea of a civic notion of nation that isn't ethnic. I also mean, which I think is hugely important, the emphasis on international law and justice, which has never been so great in any war before. It's the most documented war that has ever happened, but there are also already war crimes trials. And of course, I think the role of the ICC in indicting Putin is a huge breakthrough, at least in international justice. So it's taking forward international justice, which is absolutely the direction I think we have to go. And above all, it has involved an incredible civil society mobilization. that you really haven't seen anywhere else. And in a way, what my hopes, as opposed to my despair, is that actually this war like no other may be showing us the way in general to address new wars. And that would be very significant for the whole of European Union.
Thank you so much, Mary. Victoria.
Maybe I'm told because his approach is broader. I have a niche.
Good evening. You know, I think now it's the 10th anniversary today of the beginning of the Ukrainian Revolution. Some would say that the 10th anniversary was with the start of the Euromaidan, with the mostly student protests in Kiev on the Independence Square, Maidan Nezalezhnosti. Students gathered there in order to protest against the decision of Yanukovych's administration to not to sign the association agreement with the EU. Already, I think at that time, 10 years ago, I thought that those protests, they would probably just die out if Yanukovych had not made a huge mistake. He decided to use force against those actually few, not very many protesters, students who gathered on the Maidan. But on the 1st of December 2013, this is when the revolution really started, in my opinion. And that was a multifaceted revolution. And I think we are still living in the developments in the political and geopolitical process that was launched at that time. And Thomas introduced me as a visiting researcher at the CEU, but also as the director of the Center for Democratic Integrity. And today I want to sort of use my civil society hat and be a little bit more provocative in what I'm going to say. I do believe that it is time, maybe it's high time, for us, also for Ukrainians to talk and to think about not only about the Russian-Ukrainian war, but also about the Russian or Ukrainian-Russian relations after the war, obviously after the war. But something that we should think already now, even before the war finished. And earlier this year, so in February 2023, I was doing sort of an overview of how the European Union or European countries, not only the European Union, assisted Ukraine. And you may know there is a website, I think, run by one German university that tracks all the assistance that Ukraine gets from all over the world. Military assistance, financial assistance, humanitarian assistance. And I was going through all the European countries looking at whether they helped. And of course, I was stuck, and I had known this before, that Hungary was not of real help for Ukraine, probably even on the contrary. But at the same time, I do remember February 2022 and March 2022, how many Hungarians, representatives of civil society and just common Hungarians helped Ukrainian refugees who arrived in Budapest, how they helped them to get around, because as you may imagine, many Ukrainian refugees were abroad for the very first time in their lives, and they probably didn't even plan to go abroad. So, and in that overview of that assistance to Ukraine and the Hungarian element of this, I made a conclusion that for Ukrainians, for the Ukrainian civil society, probably for diplomats, it would be good and, of course, useful to talk to the Hungarian government. But for the Ukrainian civil society, it's very important to talk to Hungarian civil society organizations to build those contacts. And I'm using this framework or a perspective, if I may say so, in order to push for this idea that Ukrainian civil society needs to talk to the Russians. Of course, it's very difficult to talk to the Russians who now live in Russia. It's probably impossible. Also, it may put them in danger in a way. and the information system of the Russian Federation is very closed. But Ukrainian civil society activists may talk to the Russians who are now here in Europe, in the EU. Many of them help Ukrainian refugees in one way or another. Many of them do not share the Putinist view of the relations between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. And I'm saying this not only because I believe that this relationship would somehow also forge peace at some point in the future, but I also say so because I don't think that the long-term Ukraine security can be achieved without having a peaceful border between Ukraine and Russia or Russian territories, because one way or another, the length of the border will not change in international aspect. It will be the same border. Ukraine will always have on its borders Russians or Russian regions. It doesn't really matter. And I think in the modern world, there are two major guarantors of national sovereignty, territorial integrity. They are not 100% efficient, but these are the best arguments that you can always have on the table. So one is the nuclear weapons. Ukraine will unlikely ever be able to restore this nuclear status. I don't think that's going to be possible. And the second option, the second argument, is NATO membership. As I said, these are not bulletproof guarantees because, well, we know examples of Pakistan and India, both nuclear states, having conflicts. One conflict, so a permanent conflict with each other. We also know that two NATO member states, Greece and Turkey, also they have sometimes not very peaceful relations, but still, these are the best options that you can have. Ukraine, in my opinion, should absolutely try to pursue this NATO membership. This is very important. But the second option is this peaceful environment and peaceful border, essentially. Because, and I'm saying this not because I don't believe in NATO as such, but I do believe that, and it's not only about the US presidential elections in next year, but because NATO is an organization, and one way or another, any organization will at some point in the future disappear, and Ukraine cannot and should not found its long-term national security on the organization. It has to be something deeper, something more powerful. And probably it will be very interesting to discuss how these relations could be built between Ukrainian civil society and Russian civil society. But my idea of, there are several sources of this idea that I'm trying to push, knowing very well that this idea is not very popular in Ukraine. But this idea, one of the sources of that idea is the Ukrainian nationalism of the 1940s and the beginning of the 1950s. There was a strand in Ukrainian nationalism at that time, starting probably from the mid-40s, that insisted that Russians living in the Soviet Republic of Russia were a colonized people. For Ukrainian nationalism, not for all of it, but for some particular movements within Ukrainian nationalism, the Soviet Union was, of course, the main enemy, but they had discussions about the colonial nature of the Soviet Union, and several ideologues of Ukrainian nationalism at the time agreed that if we treat Ukrainians ourselves as a colonized nation, we should also look at Russians living in the Soviet Union as a colonized nation. And their argument, one of the arguments was that, yes, Russians are part of the colonial system, but what do we do with those millions of Ukrainians who also support this colonial system? So if we say that Ukrainians are nevertheless also a colonized nation that has to be freed from the oppression, from the imperial oppression, then we also should build alliances with the Russians. Not because we love them so much, but because they are also colonized people. And I believe that this anti-colonial, deeply anti-colonial idea that Russian may also be colonized people should somehow guide these, at least partly, the debate and the discussion about the relationship between Ukrainian and Russian civil society, which, in my opinion, may in the future contribute greatly to Ukraine's long-term national security. Thank you.
Thank you, Anton. So, Viktoria.
Okay, so I'll try to build up on being positive or on some positive elements, and also being a pessimist, talking about changes to European order. First of all, I wanted to mention that today is also an anniversary when Ukrainian society in 1991 voted for being not part of the Soviet Union. And this was the final point of Soviet Union's dissolution as well. And as Anton mentioned, we were celebrating anniversary of Euromaidan, or the Revolution of Dignity, just a few days ago. And I do believe that this was a very important milestone for Ukrainian society. However, it's also that society started looking toward the prospects of European integration, and it now bears a very substantial costs of this choice. For me, as for Ukrainian sociologists, what I observe is that Ukrainian society is trying to get rid of some elements of Soviet dominance and to build a new society, which sometimes goes along a very paradoxical, specific lines when we compare to the neighboring countries. And I think this could be also interesting to look at this dynamic and in much deeper and try to bring something into the discussion about what's happening and how it can be also used in different ways. What is also missing very much from the discussion about Ukrainian society, discussions about its religious pluralism and tolerance, and quite openness to the diversity, and of course, how right now war and displacement impacts both of this phenomena and ruins them. But what I want to mention, that actually Ukraine, if we are looking at post-Soviet transition, there are a lot of publications. In socioeconomic terms, was a real catastrophe. That what we know, that Ukraine experienced most severe recession in modern history, and estimates at that moment were that up to 10% of population went as a labor migrants and 60% drop of GDP. And if you look at the neighboring post-Soviet countries or post-socialist, we see that this economic suffering and political nihilism fueled very much distrust and nostalgia and need for security and stability, and authoritarian regimes became stronger there. We could speculate that based on this economic transition data, probably Ukraine initially had more conditions to become an authoritarian state than Russia, for example. and to support right-wing populism like some our Western neighbors have or had. However, political transition of Ukraine seemed to be rather a success story, resulting in relatively stable democracy in the region. And it gives us certain lens to look at or explore and look at challenges. And also what we observe in the region and in European Union, the last decade is increasingly dangerous trends of highly charged political debates about migration, refugees, that proliferate policy-making spheres and election agendas of many countries. We observe the increase of weaponization of refugees. For example, Russia's use quite purposely created movement of refugee flows, in order to argument its regional influence or certain military goals. And we also observe that academic communities cannot stand aside. And this conference for the last 2 days demonstrated that there are a lot of challenges to knowledge production. And I will limit my discussion to the challenges of migration studies, because this is, as a sociologist, what is my focus. And I can say as a provocation, on the provocative side, that we could look and exemplify some studies, recent publications on migrations, which are quite conservative and bring a lot of discussions on the topic. So what is the situation with Ukraine and what we can learn, or what are the challenges? The first challenge for me is that because of this banal colonialism, like we had banal nationalism, but we can also talk about banal colonialism. Quite often, first of all, the global East was not the part of the focus and research. And also Europe is very much seen, when it's discussed about migration politics, as a fortress, as which we have to guard, and we have these movements or attempts from global south to challenge our fortress, and we need to securitize this fortress. And we also see that another challenge is that the major focus is also mostly on labor migration or refugees. And what is missing from this picture is IDPs, internally displaced populations. And this is not only Ukraine, this is true for many other societies. And for me, it was very noticeable that beginning from 2016, Ukraine had really largest number of IDPs in Europe and one of the largest in the world. But it was not seen as an issue for European order or for European situation. And even after February 22, we have the same amount of refugees outside of the country than those inside, internally displaced. But again, the all focus is on those who are outside in host communities and what is happening to them. And if we compare, if we start from 2014, when the Russo-Ukrainian war or conflict over Donbass and annexation of Crimea started, we see that actually at that moment, Ukrainians were European others behind the wall, and because there was no visa-free regime, only small number of people could cross this line, and mostly as undocumented labor migrants at this moment. And if those who try to apply for asylum, the success rate for those applications was, depending on the country, between 2 and 5%. But at the same time, our European neighbors tried to manipulate situation and claimed that they had accepted close to 1 million Ukrainian refugees. And this was to avoid Syrian refugees quotas and so on. So, and Ukraine in this moment was also not part of the EU discussion about asylum and acute asylum situation. However, situation changed after 2017. Why? Because Ukraine received visa-free regime, and then a lot of people were able to cross the border and gradually gain a possibility for documented labor migration. And these labor migrants actually created these new diasporas, which were extremely active in after February 22, helping to host Ukrainian refugees fleeing from the war together with locals. And here I want to draw attention to certain migration governance issues. First of all, if we are talking about IDPs versus refugees, in the situation of IDPs, this is the state who is mostly responsible, according to international agreements, for supporting displaced populations in situation of refugees. These are hosting communities and hosting states. But what we observed first in Ukraine and later in our EU neighboring countries, that states and state governments or international organizations were extremely slow, extremely bureaucratized, very much working along the long learned traditions or looking for at refugees, expecting them that they will be in big masses living in specific spots where you can help and bring aid. And it was not happening. What was happening that civil society was hosting those people and they became invisible. And it brought a lot of challenges for scholars how to study them and for local communities, governments, and international organizations how to help those who are invisible, who are not present and gathered in one big place, but somewhere scattered around the cities and villages of many countries. But I think this gives us food for thought how these similar situations can be dealt with, or what it teaches us. We already received a lot, as a sociologist, a lot of feedback saying that actually this cooperation between civil society and the governments and local administrations brought a lot of new initiatives which outlived the acute humanitarian need to acute humanitarian help. And this brings the positive moments of hope. At the same time, TPD, which was a reaction to a huge wave of refugees. And again, there was a moment of hope, looking that maybe this is a new situation, maybe this is a new perspective for the migration government or refugee government in Europe, because new practices were in place, mobility, access to job market, assessment with accommodation. I was very optimistic, believing at that moment that they would be translated to other groups or into future policies. Unfortunately, what we observe currently, it didn't happen. So this optimistic scenario didn't work. And we also have and could discuss during the second round the questions of did really temporary protection the declaration worked for Ukrainian, and what is happening with Ukrainian refugees staying outside of Ukraine. But what is also important for me to come back to this bias, not seeing Ukraine as a part or not seeing Ukraine. And actually, Ukraine right now is extremely already integrated because of the refugees, because of prospects of accession, because of the situation. And it is not possible to still hold to this belief that we are fortress and what is happening outside of EU with Ukraine doesn't concern us. And in this case, all those matters which are discussed right now in Ukrainian society, would people return, the complete depopulation of cities, possibilities of restoration, these are very much part of what will be happening to you and to you order, which is not publicly brought and discussed. And I will stop.
Hey, thank you so much, Mary, Anton, and Viktoria, for these insightful remarks. So I was also very diverse in terms of their focus, and so I was thinking whether I could come up with a couple of questions that could sort of relate to all of this together, and I kind of gave up on that very quickly. So let me just sort of introduce this first round with one question for each of you. So that's what I could manage, or what I can manage. So starting with Mary, you so you drew on your own work on new wars and human security for your analysis of the current situation, and you especially highlighted sort of the what you see as kind of hopeful implications of focus on human security and how that might actually lead to a new type of security policy, also including for NATO. And so like that was kind of the hopeful message. But then I think the first part where you were sort of talking about the new wars, that was left relatively short in terms of sort of what the potentially more kind of catastrophic implications could be. And so I was simply curious if you could elaborate a little bit more on where how realistic you see this potentially happening, and kind of some of the most important implications if it were to happen. So, so that would be my question. I think I will just ask like the questions, and then you can.
Okay.
You can for Anton, I think I will leave the sort of the debate on the Ukrainian-Russian relations to speakers in the audience who probably have more to say to this. What I would be curious about is, given that we talk about European order here, is what this kind of analysis would imply for the imagination of future relations between Russia and Europe. And whether, I know this pretty well from the German context, where there's this very long debate about European security is only possible with Russia, right? And so as of late, this is kind of being questioned or challenged and debated very much in terms of whether European security is better addressed without Russia, maybe even against Russia. And so I'm simply curious to hear. And obviously that would then not be only a question about civil society actors, but sort of in the bigger picture, so to speak. Okay. And for Viktoria, my question is in a way on the optimistic side, or like on kind of wondering about the optimistic side here in terms of whether the massive refugee movements that we have been seeing from Ukraine have actually potentially contributed to a new sort of rethinking of European refugee policy, refugee governance, in broadly conceived, especially in terms of rethinking the assessment of the current refugee policy. When I draw here on recent work by Ruth Koopmans in particular, in terms of the kind of more clearer picture in terms of the current system being not only the deadliest among all migration governance system in the world in terms of people, the only way claiming a refugee status in the European Union is to actually reach European soil physically, which entails having to cross the Mediterranean, for many refugees having to cross the routes that lead to the Mediterranean Sea. and at the same time, the realization that a lot of these policies, or like because of this sort of only way to actually get to the refugee status, reaching European soil, that it actually targets totally the wrong people. That there's a lot of people who will never be able to actually get that because of the relevant resource questions, but also because of geography, also because the money that is needed for that, and also if you think about the demographics of people who arrive here across the Mediterranean. So and so basically the point is like to say, like, if we look at the Ukrainian refugee sort of movements, what we see there is kind of like that one can see like that this is kind of the way in which this system was initially conceived, and it makes sense. It's a Ukraine borders the European Union. It's a contiguous land connection there. So basically the access is immediate and obvious. It is also kind of open to for refugees of there's no real sort of cost issue involved here. If you think about the demographics, we can say like we probably have a better system here for catering for those who are most vulnerable than with some other refugee groups, so to speak. So simply the question is like, what your thoughts would be.
Okay, so the depressing scenario. And actually, I think the depressing scenario really has to do with the primarily with the economic situation inside Ukraine. The weird thing is that the Ukrainian government remains very committed to a neoliberal worldview, despite the war. And usually in wars, governments introduce war economies, and to some extent that has happened. There's an enormous amount of support for small and medium enterprises, state loans, support for defense production. But nevertheless, I mean, like happens in all wars, there's been a dramatic fall in GDP as a consequence of the war and the loss of exports and imports, a dramatic rise in unemployment, low wages. So, and of course, there are young men who don't want to become employed because that makes them eligible for conscription. But you've got a real, problem there. And you've got even the IMF saying to Ukraine, why don't you introduce progressive taxation? I mean, it's really funny that you've got that coming from Ukraine, from the IMF to the Ukraine. So the real issue is Ukraine needs to organize a sort of old-fashioned war economy and a big shift in the distribution of income. The soldiers, many of the trades unions, for example, in the armed forces, they need to be rewarded for being soldiers, which is what happens in classic wars and is not happening at the moment. I think probably it will happen, but if it doesn't happen, you are already getting everybody now. Right at the beginning, there was a distribution of guns. So people are looting, especially in the East, because they are very poor. And there is a growth of criminality. And all of that is very typical of new wars, using your guns as a source of income. So it is mainly economic, but I find the ethnic scenario, which Russia has been trying to promote from the beginning. Russia's constantly been trying to say this is a war between Russians and Ukrainians. And actually, Ukraine has been quite steadfast in the idea that it's a civic nation. And as Viktoria said, it's a diverse nation. It celebrates the fact that it has Russians, Jews, Ukrainians, Poles, Gypsies, Muslims, what. But, there is quite an emphasis on the Ukrainian language. So you could imagine that beginning to develop along new, and very typical what new, I mean, this is so classic Putin's reaction. Almost every new war I can think of starts with democracy demonstrations and then gets shifted from a conflict about democracy to a conflict about ethnicity. So Assad reacts to the demonstrations in Syria by saying, oh, all these guys are Sunnis who hate Shia. And then he targets the Sunni areas, and then Sunni donors in the Gulf think, oh, this is a Sunni Shia conflict. And so they pay to create Sunni militias. And actually, most of the democracy activists don't join on either side. They become civic activists, they become civil society, they become humanitarian. And the same thing happened in Yugoslavia. Actually, it even happened in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland began with civil rights. So these are the kinds of tendencies that I'm really nervous about. And of course, if you add to that the worry that you're not going to get continued assistance, what happens if Trump wins in America? Are the Europeans, you know, there was quite a lot of questioning this time round about European assistance. This backsliding, which Viktoria noticed, I mean, every time something happens and there's change and you think it's in a positive direction, it sort of seems to go backwards again. So all of these are factors which make me quite pessimistic, actually, despite these positive things I mentioned at the end. But can I just add something to your question to Alexander? Because I wanted to say that, well, first of all, I agree very much with what Alexander said, and I think it's really important what he's saying. I think it's really, there is an anti-war movement in Russia, even though it's very small and very underground. And it's really important somehow to know that there's another side of Russia. And I think, you know, I was among those people who hoped when the Cold War ended, and this is, as you say, a German position, we hoped that both NATO and the Warsaw Pact would be dissolved, and we would have a new pan-European Helsinki agreement, which would have included Russia, and would have been based on human security rather than the geopolitical war fighting, which NATO is based on. Now NATO is shifting towards that direction, and what I imagine would be great. I mean, it's very unlikely at the moment, but if Russia were ever to become a peaceful neighbour, one could imagine pan-European human security. My only other point I wanted to make about that is I don't see a long-term peace until there's change in South Russia. I just don't see it happening. However, but I think dialogue is very important just because one wants long-term change to happen in the right direction. But my worry is rather the opposite, that if Russia does sort of collapse internally, if the regime implodes, I think you are more likely to get the spread of kind of warlordism, a new war on Russian territory, than you are a shift to democracy. And that makes me very nervous, but it's also another reason for this kind of dialogue.
I'll probably start with what Mary said. I think that there is a view, there is a perspective on Russia and the development of European-Russian relations, is that Ukraine is key here. I think the foundation of this thought is that if Ukrainians can make it, if Ukrainians can modernize, join the Western institutions, major Western institutions, the EU and NATO, it will give to the Russians a particular lesson, a lesson that is considered by the Putin regime as very negative, and this is what probably that system is trying to avoid. And to Russians, democratically oriented Russian, liberally minded Russians, it could be a positive example. So if Ukraine can make it, like, we can also make it. And I think much of the support for Ukraine from the European Union is actually rooted in that idea that making Ukraine a prosperous, successful nation will be a huge foundation to democratize Russia. Of course, this scenario, the negative scenario about volodism and the chaos, it is quite possible. But I also believe that there will be, at some point, there will be one window of opportunity to make a change in Russia. It will be short. I hope it will be available at some point. I know also it will be very short. But the West and civil society organizations and also states, nations should be prepared for that particular moment, not to miss it and use it as, you know, as effectively and actively as possible. And then I think that would somehow maybe prevent the new Iron Curtain to fall. We don't know where it will fall. Probably it will do. But let's think in the perspective of not 10 years, but maybe 12, 20 years, 30 years. And I'm sure that in order to have a future where there is a peace there in that area of the world, we need to start investing now. And compared to the costs of the wars, the investments in the human relations, in the civil society cooperation is minuscule compared to what cost the wars can bring us and what damage it can do, not only to nations but also to entire regions.
I think your positive scenario is my negative scenario, or pessimistic scenario. First of all, it's very difficult to compare Ukrainian refugees to many others because of demographics. We know it's very different from the other waves of refugees. Because the relationship towards the regime, because Zelensky regime is still supporting democracy, and you can EU is in very intensive talks to this regime. And if we compare to situations in other countries which are sending war refugees to EU, this is, you cannot negotiate with Assad or some other regimes. Yes, it's also because, as you said, geographic proximity and visa-free regime. We have a lot of circular migration, people going back and forth, and this is not the same for other groups. So yes, they are difficult to compare, but there is important moment. This introduction of temporary protection directive was a moment when many were saying that, wow, Ukrainians are really privileged because so many groups plead for this possibility, but it was not implemented. And now Ukrainians enjoy freedom of access to the job market, being mobile, having access to social benefits. But then almost 2 years after, if we look at the situation, we see that in reality, this is the problem with the system. And this situation even more shows us how many issues and problems are there, because, for example, temporary protection is implemented very differently in different countries. And we have a situation of fragility of temporality. Germany just last week prolonged for a year the possibility of TPD till March 2025. But for example, in Poland, there are still discussions about the government, and it ends in March. And there are no information what will be happening to those people who are staying on the territory of Poland. And this is second biggest group of Ukrainian refugees. And also we don't know what will happen after March 2025. It looks like it would not be able to prolong due to EU constraints and legal constraints in EU. And also, if you look at the situation with the job market, labor market, in Poland, yes, if we look at numbers, in Poland we have 80% of employed, but absolute majority employed absolutely below their human capital level, temporary and extremely low pay jobs. In my interviews, I had several cases when the husbands had to subscribe to the military service in Ukraine in order to sustain their families in Poland. So this tells about how precarious situation with TPD could be, and what are the issues with the refugees who are coming to Europe. The same is question mobile, but for example, in Germany, if you are moving from one land to another, you have to receive a permit to move. And for my almost 90 years father-in-law, it took 6 months to get a permit just to move from one part of the Germany to the other. And it also highlights the bias, what is successful integration. Because, for example, there is an outcry in Germany that only 20% of Ukrainians are employed. So we measure successful integration by language acquisition and labor market. Then it's again a huge issue, showing the issues with the system, how problematic this system is, and that it needs a lot of discussion, a lot of effort, a lot of accommodation, or for example, very little attention to such factors. Again, if we are talking about integration, it's not only labor market, but also stereotypes, sense of belonging, cultural factors, historical memory. There are cases where there were attempts to burn the places where Ukrainian refugees are staying in Germany. So they went to the press. This is also important to discuss. And Ukrainian refugees can be used as a lens, which shows how problematic system is. And for me, the key issue, or maybe important element of discussions, is that right now in EU, we have a separate policies towards refugees and discussions about that, and separate policies towards labor migrants. And I think to think in synergies and using elements of both discussion, merging them together, might help to bring the situation to a different level and maybe have much more optimistic scenarios than ones right now we are having. We are having pogroms in Dublin. We have anti-migrant parties coming to the power again with anti-migrant slogans. So I think this is a huge way, and Ukrainian refugees could be a good lens to that.
Thank you so much. We open the floor now for questions. Do we have microphones?
Daniel Oxford, if the discussion wasn't, shall I wait for the microphone? Daniel Oxford, thanks for a wonderful discussion. Thanks for a wonderful discussion. If the discussion wasn't complex yet enough, can you let me add one layer of complexity, and which I think unites all of the speakers. You have discussed primarily about 3 places: Europe, Ukraine, and Russia. But what I am also, what I also find challenging in this context is that, the question also comes up to the table, where are the borders of Europe and European responsibility? And does it end in Ukraine? And we have enough now, to do as Europe with Ukraine? What about Moldova? What about the South Caucasus? What about Central Asia? Because these are all regions which partly have been part of, the Russian aggression even before Ukraine. Which have also to deal with consequences of the wars or new wars, which also face refugee issues, where we have much more significant parts of the Russian opposition than in Europe, and where we also have economic implications. So I'm curious, what you have to say about those spaces?
Okay, I suggest we collect a couple of questions. Are you monitoring the online?
Yes, I have a question.
Okay, if we don't have another question yet, then
So the question online is, if the Ukrainian diaspora does not return to Ukraine after the war, how will this change public opinion about Ukraine joining the EU?
Is it on? Yeah, all right, okay. Ximena Kulowska, International Relations Department, a lot of international relations at the moment. And I may be asking a bit of a conventional question, but still it might be to Mary and Anton primarily. Namely, what's the alternative to the NATO enlargement, right? And to the Ukraine accession? Is there a sort of in the Ukrainian public discourse, is the discussion about greater militarization of the state? Because there has been some conversations of Ukraine becoming the Israel of the Eastern Europe, for instance. What is your take on that?
we can start with those.
I'll first answer this question. I think on NATO, there is a consensus in the Ukrainian society. Around 80% support Ukraine's membership in NATO. I think that this idea of Israel of Eastern Europe is more of a mythology. Ukraine will not be able to become such a state. I don't think it's possible. I don't think that. Well, essentially, Ukrainian political culture is very different from that of Israel. And I don't think that there is an alternative. If we are talking about long-term national security of Ukraine, I don't think there is an alternative to NATO. If there may be an alternative if Ukraine is given guarantees, like 5-article guarantees from individual member states or individual Western states. Only, like I think South Korea has sort of very strong guarantees from the US, but I think NATO membership is almost the only solution. Otherwise, Ukraine.
May I add that there may be some NATO member states that will not ratify?
Oh, well, this is a totally different question. I'm not saying that this process is going to be easy. Look, in December, in this month, there will be a discussion about whether to begin talks about EU accession of NATO. EU accession of Ukraine. And that's probably will not even take place because of the position of one particular state. So no, it's not going to be easy. But I'm talking about long-term perspective. Yeah, this Ukraine needs to pursue this opportunity. But not only this. Yeah, and that was my argument that the national security, long-term national security and territorial integrity of Ukraine will depend on two factors: its NATO membership and the safe environment.
Is it on? Okay. Hi. My name's Eli. I'm a philosophy student. I'm from the United States. My question is related to what your opinion is on how the growing sense of American isolationism affects Europe's and Ukraine's defense policies in relation to Russian aggression.
Okay, thanks. I'm sorry, I completely forgot that we had more questions to answer actually. So maybe we can just add that.
So the question, so on the question of Israel, I don't know what it means for Ukraine to become an Israel. I'm assuming it means that Ukraine would become heavily militarized and have a war economy, which it's already becoming heavily militarized, but it doesn't have a war economy, unlike Russia. Partly it doesn't have a war economy because of Russian continuous bombardment, and it's very difficult to find safe places to develop a war economy. But partly it doesn't because of this neoliberal outlook. And I think actually it'd be very good to have a war economy, but I think it would be very bad. I mean, if Ukraine moved in the Israeli direction in terms of war fighting, that would be absolutely terrible, because we're seeing what is happening in Gaza, which are actually hugely remind me. I mean, I've been thinking about this. Israel claims that it's operating within international humanitarian law. But actually, the tactics are so similar to the tactics that Syria and Russia use, that Assad and Russia use for forced displacement. And I guess that was the purpose. They wanted to push everyone out of northern Gaza so they could operate. And so these deliberate tactics of bombing residential areas, of bombing hospitals. And for Ukraine, actually operating within international humanitarian law is hugely important to show that it's not Russia. That is part of the whole war strategy. And I think that's really important. On the issue of post-Soviet space, I mean, as I said, I would, if NATO changes to a different type of security culture, the Helsinki process actually involved all of the post-Soviet spaces. So you could have imagined a kind of, I would like to imagine in the future some kind of pan-European security arrangement that included them all. That would be my ideal. The question, there's still a question about the expansion of the European Union, which is a much more economic and security set of arrangements. And I'm always asking, well, why did not the European Union expand to North Africa? I mean, they had very close ties with Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. You know, where does Europe end? And do we see the European Union in the future a kind of model for global governance, in which case it may not end anywhere? Or do we see it as a very specific regional organization, but it has huge advantages which we hope eventually would be replicated in other areas? That's, I think, what my model would be. And just to take over some of Viktoria, but I'm sure she has a lot to say. The whole migration debate in Europe is really weird, because actually Europe desperately needs immigrants. It has huge shortages of labor, it's got an aging population, it really needs immigrants. And actually, when you think about it, when you think about the way Germany absorbed those Syrian refugees, it didn't create a kind of disruption. The whole issue is about how do we manage immigration to make sure, because actually the immigrants positively contribute to our economies, and what we have to make sure is that we expand our social services along with those economies. And I suppose, like Viktoria, I was hoping that the Ukrainian immigration, which was accepted, would make people realize this important point and extend it to other areas. And the question is, why not? And I think it has everything to do with right-wing populism. I think all of the right-wing populist leaders want to turn migration into an issue. It's absolutely extraordinary in Britain at the moment because we left the European Union in order to take control of our borders. And when, at the time that we left the European Union, our immigration was at around 200,000 a year. This year, our immigration has been 750,000, larger than in, so it's actually grown. We've actually totally failed to control our borders. And yet the Conservative, and then when you break down what it is, it's students, foreign students, because British universities are good and British universities would collapse if we didn't have foreign students. It's Ukrainians, and it's people from Hong Kong who all express solidarity. Those are the main sources of, and everybody agrees when you talk about Ukrainians, when you talk about Hong Kong, when you talk about students, everyone agrees it's a really good thing. But when it comes to the total, it is something that particularly the Conservative Party and Rishi Sunak really want to make a thing of it because that's the way they think they're going to win elections. And I just wonder how long that can be sustained, because Brexit turned out to be a total fraud. Surely British people are going to stop being taken in by this rhetoric. It's
with the question, what will happen if Ukrainians didn't return, I will probably return the question and ask, what if Ukrainians return? And in my interviews, they already have very realistic view on Europe or EU and what's happening, and full of quite often rightful criticisms of many systems. For example, that Ukrainian e-government is just a blessing in comparison to local bureaucracies and so on. So this could be reversed. But but at the beginning of my talk, I said that invisibility of the region brings invisibility of the situations in all these countries. It's not only about Ukraine, and Ukraine again could be only a lens bringing into the light issues. And we should remember that Ukraine was also hosting a lot of refugees from neighboring post-Soviet space before the February, not only minorities, but also a lot of immigrants and refugees. And now those countries are hosting Ukrainian refugees. There is a lot of dynamic in this direction. And we should also say that this East-West look, that Ukrainian refugees in EU, Ukrainian refugees, or very little information on them in Russia, but we also have a South direction. Turkey, and for many Ukrainian, especially religious minorities of Turkish origin, it's not only Crimean Tatars, but Turk Meshketins or Roma who are currently, and many others. This is important direction which is not seen and discussed, and there are a lot of issues there with migration governments as well, and the situation with them. And and one very important issue which is not discussed in Ukrainian society, and I do observe the problem similarly to Europe, that right now Ukrainian economy to rebuild itself needs, this is estimate of the government, 4 million labor. And even if we calculate those who will return, this would be approximately 2 million, 2.5 million people of working age, because a lot of those who are staying outside of Ukraine, they are with kids. So if we are talking about 5 million, this is including kids. and then Ukraine has to change from sending country actually to receiving country, and very intensively receiving country. And then if we look at the sociological polls currently, we have a very strange situation when everybody agrees that foreign companies are allowed to participate and should participate in rebuilding the Ukraine, but not foreign labor force. And this could open a Pandora box in Ukraine as well.
I forgot to. Yeah, I forgot to answer. I forgot to answer the isolationist question, and I guess I have two worries about it. I mean, on the one hand, I am very concerned about the United States being. I mean, the problem with the United States is that it's been interventionist in both bad and good ways, and nothing, I feel there was a terrible failure of multilateral intervention in Syria, which was partly the sort of American isolationist reaction to the failure of Afghanistan and Iraq. And I'm somebody who thinks the withdrawal from Afghanistan was a terrible tragedy. And that was really a continuation of the Trump isolationist policy. I'm also think that the European Union ought to be much more active and much more autonomous than it is, and not so dependent on the United States. And if there were, I'd like to see a multilateral system, a more effective United Nations, which would mean, I think, that you would have a much more effective European Union, and you'd have states like Canada, South Africa, the Latin American countries being much more effective within the UN. So in that case, American isolationism would not be so worrying. At the moment, it's rather like with the currency. I mean, the Fed is still the currency of last resort. It would be much better to have an international currency based on the IMF, but until the other countries get it together to organize it, we're still dependent on the US, and we need it to be around.
We have 3 questions from the online participants. I will just read them one by one. Question number 1. I would like to ask whether any of the panelists could envision a pathway towards a peace agreement with Russia if the war will end in a stalemate. I do not think Russia will accept Ukraine's membership in NATO. Question number 2. To all presenters, what is your attitude towards running election of the for the president of Ukraine in 2024 as scheduled? The fact is that Roosevelt went on election in 1944 during the Second World War. Do you believe the Ukrainian case is so different that a core essence of democracy should be waived indefinitely until ambiguously defined the end of the war, which could never happen? And question number 3, I would like to ask the panel how much Russia will change if when Putin is no longer in power. The first one. I would like to ask whether any of the panelists could envision a pathway towards a peace agreement with Russia if the war will end in a stalemate.
Well, let me start with this one. I personally do not believe in any peace agreement with the Russian Federation under Putin. For Putin, this war has a historical but also very personal significance. So he will be in this condition, I think, till his very end. So no agreement is really possible. There have been several agreements already with the Russian Federation. There were agreements between Ukraine and Russia. There was a Budapest memorandum of the 90s, and Russia violated all those agreements, so there is no point in believing that it will not violate it again. As for the elections, holding elections in Ukraine during the war is impossible. It's legally impossible. And among the political parties, recently we've seen that Ukrainian political parties agreed that there will be no elections until the end of the war. So there is a consensus, I think, in the political elites, and all references to, I think, to other experiences are quite irrelevant here, because this is the Ukrainian law, and this is the, I think, the final sort of guideline in this situation.
Yeah, I agree about the stalemate. I just think that the stalemate means the war will continue, and that actually is what Putin wants. Putin, in a way, will have won if he can keep the war going on indefinitely.
I think I will comment from a point of view of sociologists. I think that what is a challenge in Ukraine, that unlike in Russia, you cannot impose a decision on something from above, saying like Putin signed something and that's it, end point. Because Ukrainian society feels very much that it has a right and possibility to voice what their preferences, and if majority would disagree with the decision, it would be extremely difficult to persuade the particular decision. So I think this is a very big challenge in Ukraine. It's a democracy, but at the same time, it's a challenging how to make painful decisions if they are necessary. For example, without the consent of the society. And with elections, again, I'm speaking not as a lawyer, but as a sociologist, it's impossible because we have approximately 5 million outside of the country in EU, and we don't know how many people we do have in Russia because we don't have any reliable numbers. We have people in occupation, on occupied territories, and we have approximately 5 million of internally displaced. So how to organize elections which can be really reliable, this is tough, which is impossible for me.
There was the third question was, how much do you think Russia could change if Putin is no longer in power?
Well, it will obviously depend on who will be heading Russia. There is a class of people, there is a circle of sort of immediate Putin circle, people who may continue somehow the Putinist system. Of course, Putin has built the system for himself, and Putin may not survive the departure of his departure, but there are people who may wish to continue this particular path. But at the same time, there could be some other development. As I said, I do believe, and at least I hope, that there will be an opportunity to change the system. But there should be Russians who will be changing this system. So it's very complex.
Thank you very much. It's really I don't know, not inspiring, but thought-provoking in very good ways, but also in very sad ways. I want to ask about the question about civil society, and I'm glad that Anton introduced that track here. This war has challenged a lot of assumptions, a lot of constants of the world order, and one of those is the belief in global governance, global organizations or regional organizations and their ability to, hold the rogue regimes to account, which we've known for a long time, but I think it exposed it in a very stark way. And we also understand that Ukraine is where it is now, as to where it was predicted in the first 2 weeks of the war, of the invasion in February 2022, is not necessarily due. I mean, it helped that Zelensky has excellent speechwriters and a bit of charisma. It helped that, of course, this was perceived as an existential threat by a lot in Europe and in the democratic world. But the way Ukraine continues to function, the way Ukraine continues to have optimism and continues to have and increase its resilience is largely due to Ukrainian civil society, volunteer movement, who do receive a lot of support, but who also manage to generate a lot of support, solidarity within the country and outside. My question is about the future and the role of the civil society in the immediate aftermath of the war, as well as the role of civil society in building the kind of integration of Europe into the EU. What is the likelihood that that civil society will have a really clear, central, and vocal role that it deserves, or whether the sort of intergovernmental, whether the focus on political elites will prevail? Because when we say political elites, I do not know what it means in Ukraine today. There is no such thing in Ukraine. The old elites are gone and impotent, and currently whoever is in power is incidental or accidental, however way you want to describe it. So it really, the hopes are really in the civil society and formal and informal networks of that are forming the civic nation. Thank you.
Okay, let's divert to other questions.
Thank you. Good evening. My question is sort of a follow-up question to European dependency on the US. And that is, people have spoken prior to the Ukraine war as Europe was having fallen into a kind of decadent slumber in regards to security policy. And now we have seen an absolute unimaginable revitalization of these very same systems, such as NATO. But at the same time, also in regards to possible change in American foreign policy, Europe was shocked, was caught off guard at the realization that in military manners, the EU is totally dependent on the US. The European army, if there is something like that, is the NATO army. And whenever I was talking with European security experts, there was unity in especially one regard. Many of the European countries, such as the Austrian one, along with the European Union, have forgotten what security policy actually means. My question is, will we see a revitalization of national security policy as well as European security policy in the upcoming years? And how can we learn from, for example, the Ukraine in this regard? Thank you.
Thank you. There was one other question, I think. Yes.
Thank you for this wonderful panel. I might have missed the first part of the presentation, but my question is, how does the dynamic of Russia-Ukraine war changes if Donald Trump will come back in power in the US? Because it seems like a lot of American, like polls after polls, if we see the conservative voters, they don't approve, they don't support Ukraine as much as they support Israel. So they do not approve Biden administration on their, funding of the Ukraine as much as the Israel. And my second question is, I might be a little ignorant, but it's troubling for me to see how does this going to end? Like, for instance, 20 years felt American or the Western occupation in Afghanistan, that was still a big win for the military-industrial complex. it cost American taxpayer $8 trillion. It's per the Brown University report. And military contractors, and defense contractors, they outperform 58% by overall stock in the US stock market. So, I mean, how does it will end? Because in one side, you see the big Russian military industrial complex, and they have a nuclear weapon. So, like, what's the end goal here? Thank you, as per your opinion. Thank you.
Okay, let's maybe if there are other questions, let's just, yes, what? Okay.
Is it what? Oh, yeah, it's working.
Are there online questions?
Thank you very much for your very insightful and, as one of what somebody said, mentioned before, very sad but also thought-provoking thoughts. And I wanted to ask, probably my question will be primarily to Viktoria, but also to all of you. I wanted to ask about the temporality and basically the consequences of the war being the long-lasting, uncertain, and very traumatic phenomena. And probably it's very visible in the case of migration policies, as Viktoria has mentioned, that we still see that displaced people from Ukraine have the temporary protection status, which has to be renewed every year, and it is most likely going to be renewed. But there is always the temporality of it always raises the question: what if it's not renewed, and what would happen to all the people? But also, on the other hand, should we give them refugee status? But then the EU integration is somehow also on the way, and then can we have people who are both refugees and EU citizens at the same time? And there are lots of uncertainties here, but I also think that migration policy might be not the only policy that is suffering from this uncertain temporality issue. And what do you envision as good policy solutions in this case? Should they be rather short term, but very precise, but renewed with the possibility of the easy renewing processes, or more long term, or more forward looking, without actually knowing like how far we should look at this? And I also acknowledge that this is the question of like different types of crisis or polycrisis that always raise this temporality uncertainty issue. But I think that the war is a very specific type of a traumatic event that is that probably requires a very good way of thorough thinking about how to approach the policies in the temporariness. Thank you.
Okay, let's take the last question online then as well.
So it's a double question. How will the incoming EU elections affect public opinion on intervention in Ukraine? And how will the ongoing war influence the EU elections?
Okay, so you have a full load. This is about EU elections and how the Ukraine war will affect the elections, and also what the consequences.
I just wanted to say something. I really wanted to say something about. Oh, sorry. Is it on? Yeah. I wanted to say something mainly about the first question. First of all, I'm not sure that it's right to say that Ukraine shows the failure of regional and global governments. Actually, I think Ukraine has produced some reforms in a way. So for the Europe, I think the European Union has been quite cohesive, has provided a lot of assistance, has speeded up its shift to renewable energy. That's been all very important. But at the global level, I actually think the role of the UN has been rather constructive in several ways. I mean, first of all, there was the shift from the Security Council to the General Assembly, and the voting in the General Assembly, which was overwhelmingly actually in support of Ukraine, even though there were some countries that were neutral, but very, very few voted against. I think Guterres has played an important role, and we haven't talked about that, but I think that's been an interesting aspect of the whole, when people go on about negotiations, they don't talk about negotiations about the concrete situation on the ground. And I think the Zaporizhzhia agreement was a really significant agreement to protect the nuclear power plant and to put an international organization in the middle of the war. I also thought the grain agreement was a great agreement, but of course it's fallen apart. But so I think the UN, given the situation, actually the UN played quite a positive role. It's not, and then of course on top of that, we've had the increased visibility of the ICC. So while of course it's not what we would wish for, I still think there have been elements that have been quite positive. On the civil society mobilization, I think I'm sure Viktoria has much more to say about that than me, but we've been doing research with the Kiev School of Economics on local government. And what's been absolutely fascinating is that whereas there was always a very active civil society in Ukraine, but mainly in the towns, what you find now is very active civil society at local levels, and they are gradually being institutionalized. And I think that's sort of the story of civil society, that in a way what civil society is about is, I don't know, developing ways of dealing with problems in society. And when they become institutionalized, if you look at the history of civil society, they've become institutionalized as courts, as trade unions, as all sorts of ways that have greatly enhanced the stability of society. And you're finding that kind, and that institutionalization often happens a lot in wartime. And you're seeing that at local level, that, you know, various kinds of mental health charities suddenly turning into sort of real institutions providing help for people. So I think that's a really important element of the whole story. And actually, it's a huge element in all contemporary wars. I mean, we talk in my program about civicness. And the reason we talk about that is that civil society often consists of NGOs who are dependent on donors, but what you see is a huge amount of effort. In fact, these societies would not survive if there weren't honest doctors, honest teachers, neighbors who help each other. Otherwise, I don't know what would happen in societies. And so I keep on arguing that it's incredibly important in new war situations for the international community to link directly with civil society, which they fail to do very often. They think they have to talk to the armed actors. And Sudan at the moment is a case in point. And I raise Sudan because unlike Israel and Palestine, unlike Ukraine, Sudan, hardly anyone is talking about Sudan. And Sudan had an amazing civil society, often led by women. And these tragedies are happening and the international community isn't doing anything. And people are being kept alive by local resistance committees that are organized by civil society. And it's a really good example of this. And that's why I say Ukraine, because Ukraine is almost institutionalized with its civil society. It's hugely important for the whole war effort. And it could provide an example for other new situations. Shall I leave the other questions to all of you?
Oh, I agree very much about the civil society. First of all, it was very much overlooked because in Ukraine, when I looked at the reports, the studies were still focusing more on institutionalization, how many NGOs, productive NGOs and so on. But for me, when I studied internal displacement after 2014, the most important elements were exactly those invisible self-aid networks, organizations, which prevailed and which really taught people how to cooperate And once you've done this, then it stays with you, this knowledge. And I think we see it in other countries. For example, in Vienna, where I was, the first responders were to Ukrainians coming were exactly those NGOs which were helping previously to Syrians, because there is this civil society memory. These were simple people from the city, but they did it once and they remembered how it works and they knew how to help. So I think this element, this knowledge is extremely important. And we know from our surveys that now over 80% of Ukrainian population were exposed to some activities. So this knowledge, this resilience stays. We also see that this is civil society, which right now keeps checks and balances quite intensively on corruption, on what is happening, on this political debates and so on. What I was also positively surprised that if we look how people perceive the reconstruction, it's much less than I expected, the paternalistic expectations that give us social security and let us government to come and do something for us, because no, this is opposite way, that we should stress those elements of reconstructions which create jobs or create possibilities. It's us, not the government, who has to decide. So I do believe that these are important elements. And also in Europe, this civil society support was also quite often mentioned as one of the elements of rethinking, because we were so fed up with like a fat cats and lazy kids, and now we are back into what is democracy, what is cooperation, what is civility. With temporality, yes, this is the most problematic issue, because the question is when to start restoration. Yes, in what form? All the debates about restoration in Ukraine and rebuilding Ukraine are based on the temporality. Do we have just remedy something and wait till the end and then rebuild everything, or if it's 4 years, then probably we have to start. And the same is about the migration strategies. And one thing, if you have to brace yourself with your limited resources and constraints for a few months or half a year, and the same people can host you in their families for a year probably, but then other types of solutions are necessary. And with this temporary protection, we don't have this time span, safe time span. We are uncertain if certain government does not decide to prolong what we are facing in next few months, for example. And for me, the most problematic question is always this. They constantly want sociologists to ask for how long people are staying or what are their perspectives of return. And you cannot ask this question in this situation of an uncertainty, because people will answer something, but does it really mean something real, or just an answer because of so many uncertainties? And with studying society, it's also the time which is important, because there are so many issues. By the time you have a result, it's probably already outdated. And the question is how to plan, or how to predict, or how to build policies based on what we know about the society.
Just to add a little bit about civil society in Ukraine, much has been already said. I do believe that there is a movement between the civil society and governance. Probably there were more hopes about this movement right after the revolution in 2015. I guess some people actually from the civil society were quite disappointed that they could not penetrate this old political class of people who remained in power. They were not necessarily the remnants of the old sort of pro-Russian regime or this Yanukovych's regime, but just still the Ukrainian political class. Now I think the situation is better, but I also hope that when it comes to the reconstruction, rebuilding of Ukraine, I do hope that Western friends and allies of Ukraine will also insist that some things in Ukraine should not be reconstructed and rebuilt. They should be built and constructed from scratch. And they should also insist that Ukrainian civil society groups should be a very active part of the creation of new institutional pillars of Ukraine. So this is what I think. And about the EU elections, usually in the European elections and actually national elections in Europe, foreign policy issues are not part of the active debates. They only become part of debates, especially with this Russian-Ukrainian war, if particular political forces want to make Ukraine or the war as part of the debate. Only then people have to respond. But in general, I don't expect the war to be a major issue in these European elections next year. Maybe in countries such as Slovakia and Hungary, maybe. But in general, I don't think so. As for, there were several questions about the US. Yes, well, I think that many European officials are quite worried about the outcome of the American elections. Many understand that NATO could also be at stake, or the survival of NATO could be at stake. If you look actually at the European Union does not have nuclear weapons. No country has nuclear weapons, with the exception of France, that which has a doctrine that does not allow France to commit its nuclear weapons to any supranational organization. They only have these nukes for themselves. So with the departure of Britain, now the EU has no nukes that it could actually boast somehow. So the EU will be in a very difficult situation where if the forces of the new Republican Party, which is not the old Republican Party of John McCain, if they come to power. At the same time, there is always, I want to leave this question with a little bit of hope. As we all know, what people say when they are in the opposition is sometimes, and very often, very different from what they are going to pursue when they actually come to power. In the situation when the opposition forces have to criticize the government on almost all issues, of course, the foreign policy orientation will somehow becoming as part of criticism. But when people come to power, and again, Republicans coming to power, maybe they will change their approach. And also another ray of hope here, maybe a small one, but still a ray of hope, is that there are so many decisions that were taken by the US government. They were prepared by both parties, so there are bipartisan decisions in support of Ukraine. So it's not all lost, even with the Republican Party. So I'll leave it here.
Okay, well, thank you so much to all our panelists, and thank you for your questions and participation. And so that's the concluding the event. We have a wine reception behind, to which you are all invited. And thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.